One of the most prolific execution sites at the end of World War II was Landsberg Prison. The very place where Hitler had been locked up decades before the conflict began became an American-occupied prison, and out of the very windows where Hitler once looked, a gallows would be created to take the life of some of his most ruthless executioners, guards and doctors. Landsberg Prison claimed the lives of over 250 war criminals at the end of the conflict, with 2 gallows and a firing squad being used to execute many who had been condemned. Those who lost their lives on the gallows included Hitler's doctor, Karl Brandt, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS's personal doctor, Karl Gebhardt, SS Einsatzgruppe executioners, Otto Ohlendorf, Paul Blobel, and Werner Braun, and even some civilians who had shot a US airman. In this documentary, we look at some of the most dangerous men who were executed inside the walls of Landsberg Prison. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Karl Brandt was born on the 8th of January 1904 inside of Mulhausen, and his family were involved in the Prussian military. It's assumed that he had a normal upbringing and early life, but he studied medicine, and then in 1928 he became a doctor and a surgeon. Brandt's speciality was dealing with spinal and also head injuries, but at this time around Germany, in the 1930s, the growing influence of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler began to attract a lot of people's attention. Karl Brandt joined the Nazi Party in January 1932, and within months he had done what very few people had ever done and what they dreamed of doing, and he had met Hitler for the first time in summer of 1932. He then joined the SA, Hitler's Brown Shirts, and then the SS in July 1934. But it was clear that Hitler was very impressed with him, and Karl Brandt from this point on became known as Hitler's escort physician. Wherever Hitler went, Brandt would be on hand nearby to administer any care if it was needed, and Hitler greatly trusted him. Brandt even named his son Adolf, giving his son the middle name of the dictator when he was born. However, from early on in the Nazi policies, it was clear they would target many people who were mentally ill, disabled, or were suffering. Brandt was a man who had carried out a number of horrific procedures on women who were said to have been unwanted by the Nazis, so they could not have children. He was a man who was a doctor, but he was also someone whose ethics were very much wrapped up in the Nazi policies, and he would carry out whatever Hitler and the Nazis wanted. Brandt believed that the health of the general public and society was the most important, and that for the betterment of society, that many of those who were considered subhuman should be killed and given what was known as a merciful death. He also believed human experimentation was a legal aspect which should be done for the bettering of the whole population, and that during times of warfare, that any codes of ethics should be put aside for the victory of the war. In particular, Karl Brandt was chosen to administer the Action T4 programme. Hitler would state, Reich leader Bühler and Dr. Brandt are entrusted with the responsibility of extending the authority of physicians to be designated by name, so that patients who, after a most critical diagnosis, on the basis of human judgment, are considered incurable, can be granted mercy death, Gnadentod. This was a policy pushed through by the Nazis that saw the forced killing of between 275,000 and 300,000 mentally ill, disabled and suffering people. The killings continued throughout the Second World War, and thousands were killed in psychiatric hospitals in Germany, Austria, and in other occupied lands. There were extermination centres set up, such as one at Hartheim Castle, in which buses full of disabled people were taken, and they would be then offloaded by the vehicles and met by doctors and nurses who they believed would care for them. But these men and women would be their executioners. The method of killing used in this programme was gassing or lethal injection, and victims would be led into gas chambers unaware of what was going to happen next. Specifically, Karl Brandt was a man who organised the majority of this killing, and he was a man who had the blood of 300,000 people on his hands. It was systematic slaughter, and the Action T4 programme was known about inside of Germany, and there was even a lot of protest against it. But Brandt was a man who would advocate the sadistic experiments that took place inside the concentration camps, and Brandt along with Hitler had discussed the different ways of exterminating large numbers of people in the programme. Hitler asked Brandt what is the most humane way, and Brandt suggested using carbon monoxide gas to slaughter thousands, and the dictator then ordered his doctor and other physicians to use this. Karl Brandt was a man who was very close to Hitler, and he was part of the inner circle, and his wife, Anne, and he often visited Hitler's mountain retreat, the Berghof. He was part of a group of high-ranking Nazis that included Eva Braun, Martin Bormann, Hermann Göring, and many others. He was in particular close with Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, and the pair often spoke about their work. Brandt spoke about his involvement in the Action T4 programme, and Speer would replicate with his work in using slave labour. Karl Brandt was given further power as he was made the Commissioner of Sanitation and Health, and he continued to be promoted inside the SS. Hitler was good friends with him, and he still valued his destructive work that he was doing. But as the Second World War was coming to an end, and Hitler made his way in 1945 into the Führerbunker, Brandt remained with him in Berlin, until he was then arrested by the Gestapo. He had been making attempts to move his family out of Berlin, so they could hand themselves over to the Americans. Hitler learned about this and saw this as betrayal and treason, and ordered the arrest of his doctor, who was then charged with the offence of treason. Brandt was found guilty and was even sentenced to death, but his friendship with Heinrich Himmler saved him, as Himmler delayed the execution, and Brandt would then be captured by the Allies. Alongside 22 other defendants at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Karl Brandt was accused of 4 indictments alongside other doctors in the doctors' trial. The court proceedings carried his name, and it began on the 9th of December 1946, and throughout the trial he claimed he was simply only following orders, but this was not accepted. Brandt was accused of conspiracy to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity, war crimes, and performing medical experiments, and also crimes against humanity committed on German nationals and membership of criminal organisations. The charges placed against him also mentioned how he participated in crimes involving freezing, gassing, sterilisation, bone transplantation, experimentation with seawater, and a lot more. When he spoke throughout his trial, it was shocking to hear what Karl Brandt had to say. He stated that, "Would you believe that it was a pleasure to me to receive the order to start euthanasia? For 15 years I'd laboured at the sick bed, and every patient was to me like a brother. Every sick child I was worried about as if it had been my own. And then that hard fate hit me. Is that guilt? Was it not my first thought to limit the scope? With the deepest devotion I have tortured myself again and again, but no philosophy and other wisdom helped here. I am a doctor. I see the law of nature as being the law of reason. For that grew in my heart the love of man, and it stands before my conscience." A prosecutor at the trial said of his actions, and the other doctors that, "The defendants in this case are charged with murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. The victims of these crimes are numbered in the hundreds of thousands. A handful are only still alive. A few of the survivors will appear in the courtroom, but most are miserable victims who were slaughtered outright or died in the course of their torture, to which they were subjected. For the most part they are nameless dead. To their murderers, these wretched people were not individuals at all. They came in wholesale lots and were treated worse than animals." The courtroom did not agree with Karl Brandt's sentiments, and because of his actions he was sentenced to death. He tried to appeal for clemency and wrote to the authorities saying, "In order to raise the significance of this death sentence above the level of a mere execution of a judicial principle to a level of a deliberate act in the interest of mankind, I am of my free will willing to submit myself to a medical experiment offering no chance of survival." He was trying to barter with his body, saying he would happily give his body to an experiment, but not the execution and the gallows, which he saw as a waste. What surprised the judges of this trial was that there were also many different people who came forward to try and ask for clemency on behalf of Karl Brandt, including various medical professionals and even figures inside of the church. But all of these pleas were ignored, and Karl Brandt was then transferred to Landsberg Prison to await his death sentence. On the 2nd of June 1948, the 44-year-old former doctor of Adolf Hitler was told it was his time to die. He was led from his cell to go to the courtyard of the prison, where the huge gallows stood. Brandt was accompanied by many military policemen, and also a priest who heard his final words, and on the way to the gallows who was ranting and raving. He said on the way to the gallows and on the gallows that, "How can the nation which holds the lead in human experimentation in any conceivable form, how can that nation dare to accuse and punish other nations which only copied their experimental procedures? Only look at Germany and the way her misery has been manipulated and artificially prolonged. It is of course not surprising that the nation, which in the face of history and humanity will forever have the bear of guilt for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this nation attempts to hide itself behind moral superlatives. She does not bend the law. Justice has never been here, neither in the whole, nor in a particular what dictates its power, and this power wants victims. We are such victims. I am such a victim. 'Tis no shame to stand upon the scaffold. This is nothing but political revenge. I have served my fatherland as others before me. Whilst he continued to rant, Karl Brandt was led up the stairs of the gallows, and he was then handed over to the executioner. The executioner made the final checks to ensure that the execution would go smoothly. He then shuffled the still moaning Karl Brandt over the trapdoor. The black hood was placed over his head, and the executioner then secured the noose around his neck. He repeated his final words, but then the military policeman told him this was enough, and that he needed to be quiet, but Brandt refused and he continued to talk, as the executioner released the trapdoor, and he was sent through the scaffold to his death. Karl Brandt was a doctor of Adolf Hitler, whose work was brutal and barbaric, and he was responsible for the slaughter of around 300,000 people and civilians. His influence over Adolf Hitler was rather substantial, as he, along with other doctors, was responsible for the health of the dictator, and he grew close to the Nazi dictator. He devoted himself to the Nazi beliefs, and Karl Brandt was a doctor whose evil knew no boundaries. Werner Brauner was born on the 11th of April 1909 inside of Meerstedt, and he had a rather normal early life, attending school, and he then studied at different universities, studying law and the theory of law. But in the 1930s, he was lured into the politics of the Nazi Party, like many people in Germany were, and he joined the Nazi Party at the age of 22 when he was still a student. But people like Werner Brauner, who had a knowledge of law and politics, were seen of use by the Nazis, and in November 1931 he joined the SA, the Stormtroopers, or the Brown Shirts as they were known. The SA were at this time seen as the bodyguards of Hitler, and they were also the strongest power in the early 1930s, until they were purged, with the SS being the ones who carried out this attack on Adolf Hitler's orders. Werner Brauner joined the SS in November 1934, and he also worked for the security service known as the SD. Further work inside of police organisations such as the Gestapo continued for Brauner, and he even became the Gestapo leader for the city of Münster. In this work he would be responsible for rounding up resistors and rounding up those who were dissenting to the Nazi regime and Hitler's policies. The Gestapo would brutally torture and deport people to concentration camps too, and this would have been the daily work of Brauner. He was then transferred to become a Gestapo chief in more cities, but as the Second World War broke out, he became appointed as a commander of a horrific set of executioners known as the Einsatzgruppe. The Einsatzgruppe were a collection of SS executioners who would follow the advances of the Wehrmacht and the German army. They would round up people and civilians inside of villages and settlements, sort through these people, and then order huge numbers to go to the outskirts of the settlement. They would then be ordered to dig huge pits, which would become their graves. The people were led into these pits in small groups, where executioners armed with rifles on the edge of the pit would fire into them, instantly killing or seriously injuring. Then executioners would patrol the pit, offering further gunshots. Hundreds of thousands were slaughtered in this way, and Werner Brauner was one of those people who was commanding large numbers of the execution squads. Brauner specifically commanded Special Detachment 11B, which was part of Einsatzgruppe D. He organised and conducted the slaughter of Jews, Soviet commissars and others in the area known as Army Group South Rear Area, in this region. It was a systematic slaughter of huge numbers of people, and his brother would even be a commander inside of the death squads too. Specifically under the command of Werner Brauner, Special Detachment 11B carried out a huge massacre in which in the Crimea, over the course of 3 days, his soldiers slaughtered and murdered 14,500 Jews. They slaughtered all day and all night, and Brauner in September 1942, following being responsible for the deaths of thousands, returned to Halle, and he received a number of different promotions within the SS. He He would finish the Second World War as the leader of the German Foreign Service Academy, and he was then dispatched to Norway to serve as a commander of the security police and the SD in the occupied land. But there were many different war criminals who at the end of the Second World War tried to escape and evade any form of justice, and some lived under false papers and names to avoid detection and arrest. It's likely that Brauner would have been advised to do this by Heinrich Himmler, who offered this advice to many different adjutants and SS friends and colleagues. But Brauner was arrested at the end of the Second World War, and his legitimate identity was then discovered. He was then brought before what became known as the Einsatzgruppe trial, a series of proceedings against 22 former SS leaders who, as commanders of the death squads, took the responsibility for the crimes of those executioners. The indictments included the reports of over 1 million victims, and the court said in its judgment that, in this case, the defendants are not simply accused of planning or directing wholesale killings through channels. They are not charged with sitting in an office hundreds and thousands of miles away from the slaughter. It is asserted with particularity that these men were in the field, actively superintending, controlling, directing, and taking active part in the bloody harvest. Werner Brauner, in front of the court, claimed that he was not responsible for the killings, and he said he was only acting upon the orders given to him by his SS superiors, and those such as Heinrich Himmler. It was said of him that, in October 1941, he was assigned to Einsatzkommando 11B. As chief of this unit, Brauner knew of the Führer order and executed it to a hilt. His defence is a general one of superior orders, which avails Brauner no more than it does anyone else who executes a criminal order with the zeal that Brauner brought to the Führer order. Various reports implicate Brauner and his commando in the sordid business of illegal killing. The tribunal has already spoken of the Christmas massacre as Simferopol. Brauner was the leader in charge of this operation. He has admitted responsibility for this murder in unequivocal language. On the 10th of April 1948, Brauner was sentenced to death and he was sent to Landsberg Prison to await his death sentence. He was on death row for over 3 years inside of the same prison that Adolf Hitler had earlier been incarcerated within. But on the 7th of June 1951, Brauner was told it was his time to die, and he was led from his prison cell towards a courtyard where a large gallows could be found. He was accompanied by a priest and many military policemen that led him up to the gallows and then up the stairs. His arms and legs had been secured, but then he was handed over to the executioner. The executioner performed some final checks before placing the noose and black cap over his head, and Brauner earlier had uttered his final words as he left his prison cell, and he was shouting, "Comrades, long live Germany." Following the final checks, he was then moved over the trapdoor, and was then released through the trap, and the rope went taut, and he was executed. Werner Brauner was a brutal and ruthless executioner who had a long career inside of the SS. He was a man who would oversee the death squads, who performed the slaughter of thousands inside of German-occupied lands. He was one of a number of Einsatzgruppe commandos who were led up to the gallows that day, and he was a man who expressed little remorse for his crimes. At the age of 42 inside of Landsberg Prison, the cruelty of Werner Brauner came to an end. Klaus Schilling was born in Munich on the 5th of July 1871, and as a young man he studied medicine at university in his home city, before he received a doctorate at the age of 24. He then became a professor of parasitology at the University of Berlin, and became a member of the Malaria Commission of the League of Nations. However, he then became an international doctor, and was practicing medicine in areas of Africa colonised by the Germans. He was interested in particular in tropical medicine and malaria, and how to stop this, and he began to become celebrated in this field. He in 1905, before the First World War began, worked at the Robert Koch Institute as the first director of tropical medicines, and he remained here in this position for over 3 decades. Whilst inside of this, he developed new ideas and theories, but then retired in 1936. At the time in Germany, Hitler had come into power, but Schilling was attracted to one of Nazi Germany's greatest allies. Schilling moved to fascist Italy, as he was presented with the opportunity to conduct experiments on prisoners of psychiatric institutions in Mussolini's country. Mussolini and his army were beginning to get worried about malaria that caused problems within the Italian army, who were fighting the Italo-Ethiopian War. Schilling began to conduct a number of experiments on these patients, with the hope of helping the Italians restrict problems associated with the disease. He was rewarded by the Nazis for helping their allies research solutions to their problems, and the Nazis gave him financial grants in the hope that his work would also benefit Hitler's Wehrmacht. Following a meeting with the Nazi health chief, Leonardo Conti, Schilling came back to his homeland in 1941, and he then began to work again on malaria research. But instead of carrying out disturbing experiments on psychiatric patients, his research and work would take him into the concentration camp system. Inside of Dachau, Schilling was given a special malarial research station, and it was Himmler himself who allowed him inside of the camp to conduct his work. Many of his colleagues would criticise Schilling, but he remained in charge of the department throughout the whole of the war. In the 1930s, Schilling had stated that malarial research could be done in a harmless fashion on human subjects. However, at Dachau, his experiments were sadistic and unethical. At the camp, prisoners were drafted into the unit, and they were injected with a number of synthetic drugs at different doses. Some were given very high doses of different drugs, and others were given lethal amounts, which would often leave them in a catatonic state, or even dead. After these injections, the patients were then exposed to malaria in a rather bizarre and sadistic way. They had cages filled with malarial mosquitoes strapped to their hands and arms to make sure they were then infected by the parasite. The scale of the medical trials was huge, and more than 1,000 prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria, a deadly disease for Schilling's research. Klaus Schilling's supposed research resulted in between 300 to 400 of these prisoners being killed, and a number of them were affected for the rest of their lives by his work, being permanently disfigured or injured. During Schilling's experiments, a number of priests who had been incarcerated inside of Dachau were executed and killed by his experiments. Dachau itself was a camp where over 180,000 prisoners would pass through the gates, but over 41,000 were killed there. It was a brutal camp where there was much fear and terror, with constant floggings and public executions forcing the prisoners to fall into line. Other forms of punishment included the standing cells, but Schilling's work helped to contribute to the terror. After the liberation of Dachau, Schilling was arrested, and at this point he was around the age of 73. He was an elderly man by the standards of the other defendants in war crimes trials, but regardless of not joining the Nazi Party, he was brought to trial. During the Dachau proceedings, he was tried by a US military court, and along with 39 other defendants who worked at Dachau, he was brought towards a judge. The proceedings began on the 15th of November 1945, and Schilling and the other defendants all pleaded not guilty. Over the course of the trial, a number of witnesses and former prisoners came forward to testify about the evils inside of Dachau, including the terrible living conditions, the executions and punishments, and also the medical experiments that took place there. Klaus Schilling was seen as a slightly obscure defendant, as at the age of 74 he was the oldest, and despite not being a Nazi Party member or member of the SS, he was lumped in with the other war criminals. Schilling said he did not deny that he carried out the experiments, and admitted he had done this in the interest of science, and that suffering of the prisoners was done purely to advance medicine. Because of this, he even shockingly asked the court to allow him to finish his research and to write down his experiments. He said that he had nothing to do with Dachau itself and the evils that emerged inside the camp, and claimed that he did it purely for science. He stated, "I've worked out this great labour. It would be really a terrible loss if I could not finish my work. I don't ask you as a court, I ask you personally to do what you can to help me, that I may finish this report. I need only a table and chair and a typewriter. It would be an enormous help for science and for my colleagues, and a good part to rehabilitate myself." After this he cried, begging to finish his work, to regain his reputation. Schilling beforehand, let's remember, was a well-respected international professor, but inside the Nazi regime, he became just another war criminal. The courtroom sentenced Klaus Schilling to death, rejecting his pleas. It was heard that the prisoners he used were from Poland, the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and at the time there was no formal code of ethics regarding medical research that the doctor could be held accountable to. But it was clear he was involved in the mistreatment of prisoners, and that his actions led to the deaths of hundreds. On the 13th of December 1945, Klaus Schilling was sentenced to death by hanging, and his execution took place on the 28th of May 1946. He was held inside of Landsberg Prison, and this would be the place where he was executed. Inside of the courtyard of the prison, a large gallows had been set up, and it was on these gallows where hundreds were executed on. These gallows took the lives of many Nazi war criminals, and Klaus Schilling would be one of those. He was led out of his prison, and was flanked by US Army guards, and many prison officers who looked on in the courtyard. He was also accompanied by a priest who went with him to his death. Schilling then had his identity confirmed before he made his way up the steps and was handed over to the executioner. He had his arms tied behind his back before an executioner placed a black hood over his head and then the noose, which was attached to the gallows. Schilling was then shuffled over the trapdoor before very quickly the executioner pulled the lever and he plunged through the structure to his death. After his execution, doctors confirmed his death, and his remains were then placed in a coffin marked Dr. Schilling, Klaus. Despite never joining the Nazi Party or the SS, Klaus Schilling was treated like other Nazi war criminals. He was a man who claimed for his research that it was necessary to kill hundreds of innocent people, which was ridiculous to consider. During the course of his work in Dachau, over 1,000 prisoners were deliberately infected with a dangerous disease that could kill, and they were also injected with a variety of medications that were often lethal. He was 74 when he went to the gallows at Landsberg Prison, and Klaus Schilling's execution remains a compelling one, and one that is slightly different to other Nazi war criminals.
Karl Gebhardt was born on the 23rd of November 1897 in Bavaria within the German Empire. When he was a medical student, he began to become involved in revolutionary movements with a more nationalistic undertone, whilst he was studying in Munich around 1919. After a number of years of study, Gebhardt received his first job as an intern at the surgical clinic at the University of Munich, and he worked under a number of skilled surgeons. Before the Second World War broke out, he had made a number of impressive breakthroughs and developments in surgery, and in particular sports medicine, and dealing with physical injuries. He wrote many papers and textbooks and was considered a leading expert across the world, not just in Germany. So Karl Gebhardt was considered a respected doctor and surgeon. However, he focused on his nationalistic beliefs and joined the Nazi Party on the 1st of May 1933. Hitler had seized power, and the Nazis for many seemed like the political party that would help many in Germany forget about the suffering caused by hyperinflation and the First World War. Karl then moved to Berlin in 1935, where he became a professor, and then he joined the SS, becoming a medical superintendent of a sanatorium. Whilst in this role, Gebhardt revolutionised the sanatorium, changing it from a place for tuberculosis patients into a clinic and hospital for broken bones and injuries. Here he even began the first sports medicine clinic in Germany, and worked closely with amputees and those with disabilities, developing different programs for them. During the 1936 Summer Olympics, Karl Gebhardt was a senior physician, and his sanatorium became the main sports recovery facility for the Nazis, and also for those athletes who took part in the Olympics. However, in 1938, his association with one of the most evil men in history, Heinrich Himmler, began, when he became Himmler's personal physician and doctor. He had risen to an incredibly powerful and respectable position in medicine in Germany, but it's within the Nazi regime that he would tumble into a more bizarre and sinister role. When the Second World War occurred, Gebhardt worked as a chief surgeon of the staff of the Reich, and his own sanatorium was used as a military hospital for the Waffen-SS, the incredibly powerful soldiers that fought for the Third Reich. He continued to operate within this hospital and provide care for Nazi Germany's most important, and on the 27th of May 1942, Himmler sent Gebhardt to Prague. There was a huge issue for the Nazis, as Reinhard Heydrich had been attacked by Czech resistance fighters. An anti-tank grenade had injured Heydrich, who was working as the Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and he was suffering greatly. Gebhardt was sent to keep Heydrich alive and save his life. However, this could not be done. Hitler's own doctor, Theodor Morell, suggested that Gebhardt should use sulfonamide, which was considered an early antibiotic. Gebhardt refused Morell's advice, and 8 days after he was attacked, Heydrich contracted sepsis and died on the 4th of June 1942. If Gebhardt would have listened, it's possible that Heydrich's life could have been saved. During the Second World War, one of the sickest crimes that the Nazis conducted was the sadistic experiments that were carried out within the concentration camps. During the conflict, Gebhardt indulged in many surgical and medical experiments at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz concentration camp. One camp commandant even did not want to give permission for Gebhardt to experiment. However, he was forced to allow the experimentation to take place by the SS. Himmler told Gebhardt to experiment with sulfonamide, and to prove that in fact it would have been useless in treating Heydrich's wounds. For this, Gebhardt worked hard to absolve himself. However, it was at the expense of the poor prisoners inside Ravensbrück. Gebhardt broke the legs of many of his patients, and then he infected them with different organisms and substances, and he would go further. He also tried to transplant limbs from the victims inside the camps onto German soldiers who were wounded during Operation Barbarossa. Gebhardt would go even further with the experiments too. However, he was an incredibly sadistic man, obsessed with absolving himself for Heydrich's death, and also furthering his own reputation. There's no doubt that before the Second World War, he made significant progress within medicine. However, under the guise of the conflict, he inflicted such suffering and misery. In 1944, his reputation would be questioned even further, as he tried to treat the Minister of Armaments Albert Speer for fatigue. Speer had been working incredibly hard, and Gebhardt treated him for his tiredness and swollen knee. However, he almost killed Speer by accident. He did rise throughout the SS, but as the Second World War came to an end, he was in Berlin, as the advancing Red Army was heading towards the heart of the Third Reich. Joseph Goebbels took his children with him to the Führer bunker, to stay with Hitler and the last few loyal members close to Hitler. However, Gebhardt tried to convince Goebbels to take his children out of the city and escape. Goebbels, intent on dying alongside Hitler, dismissed Gebhardt, and he was then captured after the Second World War and was placed on trial. During the doctor's trial, which began on the 9th of December 1946, 22 doctors and Karl Gebhardt faced the judges with regards to their crimes they committed during the Second World War. Gebhardt was accused of conducting the experiments and was in fact found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was then sentenced to death on the 20th of August 1947, along with a number of other doctors. After this he said, "In seeing my responsibility in this way, I of course made a decision for myself. I hope that hitherto I have always faced criticism, even from foreign countries, without any secrecy, but also without feeling of guilt for my activities as an expert. My last sentence is to express our own personal gratitude to Dr. Seidel, who has stood by the side of my colleagues and myself so conscientiously and with such human kindness." On the 2nd of June 1948 in Landsberg Prison in Bavaria, Karl Gebhardt's life came to an end. He woke early that morning and was taken from his cell in the prison to the execution chamber. A specially created gallows had been made for the executions, and the doctors who had been sentenced to death were executed on this. Karl Gebhardt was one of these, and he was swiftly executed for the horrific crimes he took part in during the Holocaust. The story of Karl Gebhardt is an incredibly interesting one, for had he not joined the Nazi Party, then it's most probable that he would not have been in a position to develop the sports medicine like he did. He benefited greatly from the Nazis and was given great opportunity to serve as the head of a sanatorium. However, he was a man who also carried out cruel and inhumane experiments within the walls of the concentration camps. He was a man who made big leaps for certain fields of medicine. However, he was an incredibly brutal one, whose barbaric experiments should not be forgotten. Following the Nuremberg trials, a code was drawn up on experimentation, and trials on humans in the following years after the Holocaust to stop people like Karl Gebhardt committing crimes against humanity.
Oswald Perl was born on the 30th of June 1892. His father was a blacksmith and he was one of 8 children. His family were well off, and at school he studied classics such as Greek and Latin, and he admitted he always wished to study science, but he did not go to university for this. Instead, he went into the Navy and became a sailor, and he served during the First World War in the Baltic Sea and along the coast of Flanders. He got married in 1918, but following the war, like so many soldiers, he felt at a loose end, and he attended a trade school and began to study law. But he dropped out of university and then started to work as a paymaster for the Freikorps in Berlin, Upper Silesia and the Ruhr Basin. In this role, Perl, like many, were unhappy with the Weimar government, and as a member of the Freikorps, he was a militant part of the resistance to the German post-World War I government. But like many other Freikorps members, Oswald Perl would hear about the Nazis and the Nazi Party, and he was attracted to their right-wing politics. He joined the SA in 1925, and then joined the Nazi Party in February 1926, but then 3 years later joined the SS. He would state that, "I was a National Socialist before National Socialism became a thing." In 1933 he met with Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was impressed with Paul, and he described him as an energetic and dedicated Nazi, and Paul continued to impress Himmler following more meetings. He had experience in leadership and had already overseen 500 soldiers in the Navy during wartime, but he became desperate to become an officer with the SS and to begin climbing the ranks. Inside of the SS, Paul worked quickly, and he gained plaudits for changing the SS accounting systems, and he gained lots of respect for this, and further promotions came. He was seen as a skilled administrator, and was then appointed the chief of the administration department in the staff of Himmler himself. Paul wrote, "Himmler became very insistent, and wrote me one letter after another, urging that I take over the administrative organisation of the SS. In December 1933 and January 1934, he invited me to Berlin and Munich, and showed me the whole SS administrative setup, and the many complex problems that were involved. It was only in February 1934, after I saw what a big job was in store for me, that I finally accepted." He also founded the Society for the Preservation and Fostering of German Cultural Monuments, which was based at Wewelsburg Castle, and was supposed to be a centre of SS worship. But over time, Oswald Pohl's role in the administrative proceedings will lead to him working in the concentration camp system and overseeing it. Pohl said when he joined Himmler's personal staff that, "When I took over my office, the SS was a comparatively small organisation, like a union with a group here and there in various towns and cities. I started by installing administrative commands in various key cities, and I selected personnel who would be fit for their jobs. I inaugurated schools that taught these administrative officials for a few weeks, before they were then dispatched to take over my branch offices all over Germany. I achieved a sound administration in the SS, with orderly bookkeeping and financial sections." Pohl, inside of the concentration camp system, realised that slave labour was needed for economic purposes, and following the Austrian Anschluss, Pohl accompanied Himmler to Mauthausen, where it was decided that concentration camp prisoners and slave labourers would be forced to work inside the quarries there, with a camp being created. The finances of the SS were controlled by Pohl, and he worked on budgeting building projects of many concentration camps. He became the chief for the budget and construction of these camps, and Himmler later brought all of the SS admin into one office, called the SS Main Economic and Administration Office, with Pohl being the head of this. He was the third most powerful figure in the SS behind Himmler and Heydrich, and it was said that he controlled the 20 concentration camps and 165 labour camps. He directed all the SS and police building projects, and was in charge of all the SS economic enterprises. He would take the profits of the slave labour, and then reinvest it building larger and bigger camps, which eventually became death camps, fitted with gas chambers and execution sites. Pohl even complained that the death rate of prisoners inside the camps was leading to a dent in the economic output of them. He became incredibly powerful, and was a chairman of the board of directors for the Eastern Territories Industries Limited. He expanded the SS economics industries and created even more camps and sub-camps, and many of his policies were driven by money, but they caused such death and devastation. For example, Pohl refused to allow any increase in rations for starving prisoners who were working themselves to death in the granite works at the Gross Rosen camp, and with this he was also having a role in the racial extermination of the camps, working people to their deaths. He oversaw the organisation of the concentration camps until 1944, and his ideas were based on extermination through labour, and to exploit prisoners as much as they could to maximise financial profit from the work. Poll was obsessive in this profit, and even tried to predict the average life expectancy of prisoners and the value of them, which he equated for being 9 months and a value of 1,630 marks. He also oversaw the task of collecting gold fillings from Jewish people who had died, along with their hair, clothing, jewellery and possessions, which was stolen from the prisoners and then sold on. It was under his plan that Auschwitz grew into a huge killing complex, and that Majdanek and Stutthof became huge killing sites. His organisation funded the creation of these death camps, and the expansion of the killing of the Holocaust was funded by Poll's office. He would butt heads with Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, about production, saying, "Right Minister Speer appears not to know that we have 160,000 inmates at present and are fighting continually against epidemics and a high death rate because of the billeting of the prisoners, and the sanitary arrangements are totally inadequate." It was all about production, and as the war was turning against the Germans, there was a distinct need to increase armaments production. New facilities were made by the SS for arms production, and further camps created wonder weapons such as the V2 rocket. All of these areas were funded by Poll's work and office. But by summer 1944, Poll's control of the concentration camps was given to local offices, and at the end of the war, Poll went on the run. He hid in Upper Bavaria, and then tried to pass himself off as a farm worker, before he was arrested by the British in May 1946. He was placed on trial in the Poll trial, and was the main defendant, along with 17 other SS officers, employed by the SS main economic and administrative office that he oversaw. He was accused of 4 crimes: participating in a common plan to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against humanity and membership of a criminal organisation, the SS. He did not deny the mass killings of Jews and other prisoners, and witnesses told of the horrors inside of the camps, but Poll said he was just an executive or an office worker, with people above him calling the shots. He accused the prosecution of being guided by their own personal hatred and by revenge, but was sentenced to death, being found guilty of all 4 charges. Despite appealing his death sentence, Oswald Poll would go to the gallows shortly after midnight on the 7th of June 1951. He would have been led out of his cell under the cover of darkness and taken into a courtyard where the gallows stood. The gallows at Landsberg Prison was where hundreds of Nazi war criminals were executed. Accompanied to his execution by scores of military police and guards, Poll was also joined by a Catholic priest who stayed with him until he was handed over to the executioner. He was taken up to the gallows and his identity was confirmed, before he was then led up to the stairs and handed over to the executioner. His arms and legs had been secured, before the executioner placed a black hood over his head, and then the noose. As he was placed over the trapdoor, the lever was quickly pushed, and Oswald Poll plunged to his death. Oswald Poll was one of the main administrators of the concentration camps, and he had accompanied Himmler on many visits to build new camps and sites where horrific crimes and murder took place. He was linked to the slave labour element inside the camps that killed thousands, and his office would be the ones funding expansion inside of camps such as Auschwitz, where their killing capabilities were increased heavily. He was a despicable man whose work led to millions being killed.
Otto Erlendorf was born on the 4th of February 1907, and he grew up inside of a family of farmers. It's assumed that he had a rather normal upbringing, but when he was 18 he joined the Nazi Party, and was considered one of the earliest members. Thousands of younger people across Germany began to become attracted to the politics of Hitler and the Nazis, but Erlendorf the following year joined the SS, and at this time they were not the paramilitary brutal force that they would later become. They were nowhere near as powerful as Hitler's brown shirt CSA. But in the years following, Erlendorf went to university and studied economics and law, and he also became a doctor of law, and men who had this amount of knowledge, who were also Nazis, would be seen as useful by Hitler. But Erlendorf threw himself into the Nazi Party's regime as their power over Germany increased, and he taught in Nazi schools in Berlin. He was seen as a good lawyer, who often intervened with debates between the SS and other organisations, and in 1937 he joined the SD, the intelligence service of the SS. It was his job to help in the arrest and roundup of those men and women who opposed Hitler, and specifically he was involved in the economic side of the organisation. But Otto Ehrendorf continued to rise throughout the ranks of the SS, and he did gain a number of senior positions and promotions. But he would upset a number of people, and he worked to collect intelligence from secret agents, and some in the Nazi Party disliked his work. This included the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, who once described Otto Ehrendorf as an unbearable Prussian who had no sense of humour. But he was a powerful man inside of the SD, and he continued to carry on the brutal work of the Nazi Party, especially as the persecution of people ramped up across the nation. However, as the Second World War raged across Europe, Ehrendorf was recruited by the head of the SD, Reinhard Heydrich, to carry out a role in which he would be incredibly ruthless and brutal. The man who would be happy sitting behind a desk a lot of the time would now be on the front lines of the Second World War, arranging execution squads, which were known as the Einsatzgruppe. Heydrich appointed Ehrendorf to become the commander of Einsatzgruppe D, and these saw action in the region of the Crimea. The Einsatzgruppe were the horrific death squads that followed the advances of the German army. These SS executioners would round up civilians in a settlement or a small town. They would then sort through the population, then lead those who were to be executed to the edge of a town or a concealed area. Here these people were forced to dig huge pits which would become their graves, and in small groups the civilians were led into the pits, where the executioners would stand on the edge, aiming their rifles at them, then take a fatal shot. Others were led into the pits and were told to lie on the corpses of those before an executioner administered a shot in the back of their necks. It was cold-blooded slaughter, and the Einsatzgruppe were responsible for the slaughter of millions. Ehrendorf's executioners, specifically Einsatzgruppe D, were the smallest of the forces, but they were helped out in their murderous actions by men from other nations, and they continued their slaughter throughout different Soviet lands. His men were attached to the 11th Army. They would follow their advances, and his group were responsible for a massacre in December 1941 at Simferopol, which resulted in over 14,000 people's deaths. In this region where he operated, over 90,000 people were killed by his actions and his unit. Ehrendorf himself did not like the use of the shot of the back of the neck, and he would prefer to order his execution squads to shoot like a normal firing squad from a distance, so that the executioners did not accept as much responsibility for their actions. He banned any contact between the firing squads and the victims, and as many as 3 executioners with their rifles were to shoot one person. He also told his men not to steal any of the victims' property, and instigated a military-style execution to the proceedings, and it was one of his executioners that said, "A man is the lord over life and death when he gets an order to shoot 300 children, and he kills at least 150 himself." Otto Ehrendorf was there on the front lines, and he was there witnessing the killing. He was approached by Himmler to use gas fans to slaughter people too, but Ehrendorf stated that his men refused to use them, as they found burying the victims too much after. He saw these as impractical, and said that it would take too long to kill, but Otto Ehrendorf was a man who was incredibly devoted to the Nazi cause, and he never complained once about the murderous actions. He did, though, once complain about the actions of some of the other soldiers from other nations he was overseeing in his death squads, who were committing scores of atrocities as well as being the executioners. But as well as being responsible for the slaughter squads, Ehrendorf also had other jobs, such as being the Deputy Director General for the Reich Ministry of Economic Affairs. He was seen as a man who would be of use by Hitler, and he even made plans for the future of Germany when he believed the war would be won. However, as the war turned against the Germans, it was clear to Himmler and high-ranking SS members that one day they would be hunted for being barbaric war criminals. Himmler instructed those close to him to obtain false papers and assume new identities, but Ehrendorf was involved in Heinrich Himmler's flight to Landsberg, and he actually was arrested by the British in May 1945, and shortly after this Heinrich Himmler would take his own life after his capture. Ehrendorf was interrogated, and he would during these interviews tell of the horrific actions of the German army in the east, and he was later brought to the Einsatzgruppe trial. The court proceedings tried to punish those men who were the commanders and leaders inside of the Einsatzgruppe, and they were said to have been responsible for the murders of over 1 million people. Otto Ehrendorf was seen as one of the most powerful defendants, and he was the chief defendant. He also gave evidence that was used against the other war criminals, and was said to have been a reliable source of information. He was a devout Nazi, but he was a man who hated corruption, and he had a strong commitment to his duty. During his trial, he claimed that he was a loyal Nazi, and he admitted that he acted properly, and what he had done was not wrong at all. He had no remorse for his actions, and he believed the slaughter he oversaw was justified. Later, the prosecutor involved in his trial would outline Ehrendorf's comments, and he said, when Ehrendorf was asked to verify that his unit had murdered 90,000 Jews, the SS general began to quibble. He said he could not confirm it. The reason given was that sometimes his men exaggerated the body count. Would the general care to venture an estimate? No. Was it perhaps 80,000 or over 70,000? That was possible. Or perhaps 100,000? Maybe. And were there many Jewish children amongst those who were killed? Yes, of course. But, added Ehrendorf, he never allowed his men to do as some other units did. He told his men never to use infants for target practice, nor smash their heads against a tree. He ordered his men to allow the mother to hold her infant to her breast and to aim for her heart. That would avoid screaming, and would allow the shooter to kill both mother and child with one bullet. It saved ammunition. Ehrendorf said he refused to use the gas vans that were assigned to his companies. He found that when the mobile killing vehicles arrived at their destination, when they were supposed to dump their asphyxiated corpse into a waiting ditch, some of the captives were still alive and had to be unloaded by hand. His troops had to drag out corpses amid vomit and excrement, and that was very hard on his men, Ehrendorf claimed. At the trial, he tried to state that the actions of the Einsatzgruppe were aimed at securing the newly occupied areas, and he claimed it was necessary to make sure that the occupations of these regions went smoothly. But this did not win over the court, and he said that his firing squads were no worse than the press-button killers who dropped the atom bomb on Japan. But for his actions, Otto Ehrendorf was sentenced to death in April 1948. He was transferred to Landsberg Prison to await his execution, and he spent 3 years behind bars before it was time for his date with the executioner. On the 7th of June 1951, he was led out to his prison cell and was accompanied by American military policemen and also a priest, who was there to give him spiritual guidance in his final moments. It was just past midnight, and Ehrendorf was led up to the gallows in the courtyard, and he was then helped up the stairs of the execution device and structure after he had his legs and arms secured behind his back. The executioner, whilst he was on the scaffold, checked some parts of the execution process, and then shuffled him over the trapdoor, and then a photographer took a final image of Otto Ehrendorf with the executioner and his assistant, and it showed him looking straight at the camera, being very pensive, and he did not appear to show much remorse. The executioner then placed a black cap over his head and then the noose. This was secured, then the trapdoor was released, and instantly Otto Ehrendorf was executed, and he was then placed inside of a coffin after his death was confirmed. Otto Ehrendorf was responsible for the executions of around 95,000 people, and his actions were horrific and ruthless. He had no regard for the men, women and children who the Einsatzgruppe under his command slaughtered, and his crimes were carried out across much of the Eastern Front. He was sentenced to death for his actions following his trial, and at the age of 44 inside of Landsberg Prison on the gallows, Otto Ehrendorf's life came to an end. George Schallemer was born on the 29th of December 1894 inside of Hebertshausen, and little is known about his early life. But for a career before the Second World War broke out, he worked as a builder. He was a member of the Nazi Party and was a strict follower of Hitler's politics, like so many people were across Germany at the time. But during the guise of the conflict, he would become a brute and a barbaric guard who served inside of the concentration camps. Schallemer served inside of the German army in the Wehrmacht until 1944, and he would then be drafted across to the Waffen-SS, and he would serve under the SS inside of the concentration camps. It's not known why Schallemer switched from the army to the concentration camps and why he left the front lines. One possibility is that he could have been injured in combat and then drafted to guard prisoners like many who were wounded would. Many concentration camp guards were sent the other way to the front lines at this time during the Second World War as things got desperate for the German army, and they needed more forces to defend the Reich as they were being pushed back heavily. But from August 1944 to May 1945, Schalemer served under the Commandant, Walter Adolf Langleist, inside of the Mulhdorf concentration camp. This was a subcamp of Dachau and was found not too far from it, and the prisoners here were to work inside of underground tunnels, making the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter aircraft, which was considered one of Hitler's wonder weapons. The conditions at Mulhdorf were absolutely awful. The SS guards carried out selections at the camp, and prisoners who were sick or suffering, and those who had been injured, were sent to Auschwitz, and within hours of arriving at the camp, they had been exterminated inside of gas chambers and the deadliest concentration camp. In fact, more than half of the prisoners who were sent to Mulhdorf would be sent to the killing chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau, or they died at the site from overwork, shootings and executions, disease and violent beatings at the hands of the guards, such as George Schalemer. Prisoners were forced to work 10 to 12-hour days, carrying incredibly heavy bags of cement around. They were given hardly any food or access to sanitation. As the American army approached the site at the end of the war, the SS guards evacuated around 3,600 prisoners on death marches from the site. George Schalemer, in particular, was known for being a brutal guard. It was said that he was responsible for the conditions of the camp, along with the other guards, and for the lack of care given to the prisoners, which led to the deaths of a large number of inmates through illness and starvation. He was also accused of having beaten many prisoners to death with his bare hands, and also in administering beatings that were not asked of him, meaning he took the law of the camp into his own hands. He was also, shockingly, accused of a particularly heinous crime, and that was having overseen the removal of gold teeth from those prisoners who died and forcing an inmate doctor to do this. It was said of this specific crime that George Schalemer, as leader of the Roll Command, was directly responsible for the prisoners in Mulhdorf, a subcamp of Dachau. He himself beat many prisoners in such a way that they died of the result. Of 300 people who were brought to the camp in autumn 1944, only 72 were alive after 4 months. Every day he visited the morgue with a dentist, imprisoned, to break out the dead gold teeth. Many witnesses later came forward about the work of George Schalemer, and he was at the end of the Second World War brought to trial for his actions. The deaths that occurred at Mulhdorf were recorded in the camp's records, and it was said that Schalemer was a typical SS brute and a thug who had no regard for the lives of prisoners. When he spoke out in his defence, Schalemer claimed that he was only keeping law and order at the camp, and that he only ever punished inmates who had committed serious violations of the rules, and that he did this to keep prisoners in line. He also claimed he had never killed an inmate, and regarding the removal of prisoner teeth, he claimed he had actually been instructed to do this by a higher SS officer. However, on the 23rd of September 1947, the courtroom found George Schalemer guilty of war crimes, and he was sentenced to death, and was specifically to be sentenced to death by hanging. Before his death sentence was carried out, there were a number of reviews that confirmed his sentence. During one review it was said that the evidence clearly shows that the fact the defendant, as an SS Hauptscharführer and rapport leader in the Mulhdorf subcamp, was involved in the mass crimes in connection with the Dachau concentration camp. It is also clearly proven that the defendant personally abused and beat numerous camp inmates. Many of the inmates died as a result of the defendant's brutal beatings. The evidence justifies a guilty verdict. The sentence is not overly harsh. But in the years following this, there were calls by many people inside of Germany to release the prisoners who were sitting on death row, awaiting their executions in Landsberg Prison. Sometimes it took years for prisoners to be sent to the gallows, and many spent a long time inside of the prison before it was time for their date with the executioner. In fact, Hermann Pister, the commandant of Buchenwald, even died of a heart attack before his execution date inside of the prison. There were many reviews that were carried out to see if there was any justification to release Schalemer from his death sentence, but ultimately it was said that there are no facts or arguments that could in any way justify grace in this case. This meant that the death sentence of Schalemer was confirmed, and other legal groups tried their best to gain some form of clemency. On the 6th of June 1951, 6 years after the Second World War had come to an end, the US Supreme Court rejected the final motions regarding Schalemer's possible reprieve, and they argued that sparing him could send a dangerous message and encourage right-wing pro-Nazi tendencies and beliefs inside of Germany. It would be just a day later that they would carry out the execution of the former guard who had been sat on death row for many years, awaiting his execution. On the 7th of June 1951, George Chalamet was told it was his time to go and meet the executioner. He left his prison cell, and with him was a priest who offered him final blessings, and many American military policemen. They led him out to the courtyard where the gallows was found, and Chalamet's arms and legs were secured at the bottom of the steps of the gallows, and his identity was then confirmed. He was then helped by the military policeman up the stairs of the gallows and onto the scaffold where the executioner greeted him. He checked the binding of his arms and legs, and then shuffled him over to where the trapdoor could be found. A photographer took a final image of George Chalamet with his arms held by American guards. Then the executioner placed a black cap over his head and then secured the noose around his neck. Chalamet was then sent crashing through the trapdoor, and he was executed and was left dangling for a number of minutes before his death was confirmed. George Chalamet was one of many former concentration camp guards who were sent to the gallows in the years following the Second World War, but what is striking is that he was a soldier for the majority of the conflict, but found himself within the camps for just over a year. But he quickly became a brute and a beast who was responsible for a huge degree of slaughter and suffering, and some of the crimes he was accused of were truly evil and barbaric. Despite the calls for clemency, he was another victim of the gallows of Landsberg Prison.